So I want to kind of walk through, if you will, three locations for work and economics, kind of three ways to think about work and economics, and think about it in three perspectives. And I want to do this for a couple of reasons. One is that it's going to get at some misperceptions and some struggles that sometimes believers fall into with regards to work and economics and our identity and all those kind of things. And then to get down to some practical cases of what people are wrestling with today and how we get there. So I want to start off with thinking about work and economics in creation. And we did a little bit of this last time, but I want to remind you of this. So I'm going to start with Genesis 2, verses 10 to 14. So Genesis 2, 10 to 14. So this is the second story of creation. And we're getting kind of a description of the garden and its area. And Genesis 2:10 reads, "A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became four rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It's the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there's gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there as well. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It's the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth is the Euphrates." So this is before the fall, right? So sin's not entered into things yet. Is that me? Yeah, okay. So sin has not entered the picture yet. But if you pay attention to this, what does it mean that there's gold in Havilah if you don't live in Havilah? It means you don't have gold. And what if you live somewhere with gold, but it's not Havilah? You don't have good gold. Havilah has better gold than the gold that you have. So this means that the way that God created the world, He did not create it that every place had every resource and of the same quality. So diversity of resources and even diversity of quality and access to resources is inherently divided within the creation. Okay? Now, let me join that with this next thought, which, remember Genesis 1:28. This is where we spent the majority of our time last time. But just to remind you, in Genesis 1:28, the basic command that God has given humanity is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So now we're told that the primary command that they have in filling the earth is that they are supposed to move out of the garden. So we live somewhere, let's imagine, in the garden where we have lots of timber. But now I move to an area that has only stone and no good timber. Israel understands this, right? They've got to send up to Lebanon to get cedar and the other trees that they need to build the temple. They don't have it locally. God did not provide it in Israel. So even before the fall, if humanity, let's imagine the fall had not happened, if humanity had grown, obeyed the command, and moved out of Eden into all of the world, it means then that every community has some things that benefit them that they need that are high quality. They have some that are lower quality. They have some they don't have any at all and no access to. That means that economics are an inherent part of creation. I live where there's stone, you live where there's timber. If we're going to build, we are going to have to trade. The most basic form of economics has to take place, and it's baked into the way God created the world. That means then that business, as we think of this nature of trading, whether it's raw trade and barter, whether it's labor for materials, whether it's money-based, is part and parcel of how God created humanity to work, right? It's part of being cooperative and communal in the way that we live life. We cooperate together for each other's good, without sin, justly, fair prices, fair trade, all those things. But it's how we're designed to live. We were never designed to be independent of the other communities that would naturally develop as humanity spread throughout the earth. So tensions that we feel with business and the need to go back and forth and that we're not solely self-independent and all those kind of things are part of how God has created us, not a result of the fall. Oftentimes, business and economics has been cast as something that only takes place because of the sinful world, and now we have to do this? And the answer is no. Because there's a place with good gold, which means there's a place with no gold, or a place with lesser gold before the fall ever happens. So the basic things that we do in work to provide services, to trade materials, all those kinds of things are reflecting the fact that God created humanity to be finite. I have limited resources of time, energy, and capacity. Now, this continues in a really easy way to see in the church, right? So God gave everybody the same gift. No. God gave different gifts to the body. And just like in economics, Paul teaches us that sometimes the body struggles with that. I don't like my gift. I want yours. And I wish that my gift was more prominent, but you're the one that's up there and up front. So I wish, right? We have the same struggles economically that we have with gifts in the church, and that sometimes we want what has been given to another. But both the church, the kingdom, as well as creation were designed the same way. We are finite. We must flourish by living communally and cooperatively. Whether it's in the kingdom, I have to have your gifts. I can't just have mine. I need all of yours for the church to work well. And we have to use them as God's designed them. I can't be jealous of yours. You can't be jealous of mine. I can't withhold mine, and you can't withhold yours. Or the church doesn't operate the way God designed it. In creation, Raleigh, in work and economics, we are designed to cooperate and complement one another. So in business, this is oftentimes thought of through the principle of comparative advantage. There are things that you are better at, and it is more efficient for me to pay you to do what you're really good at, to do it high quality, to do it well, to do it efficiently, than for me to try and do it myself. I focus on what I'm good at, and I offer that to you, and this is the nature of the trade that we do, because it's the way that we've been designed, it's the way that we're gifted, and it's the way humanity's been designed to work in creation and in the kingdom, communal, cooperative, recognizing that each of us are finite, and to flourish, we must have one another. We must serve one another. I need what you have, and you need what I have, and we must contribute it together for life to work, whether we're talking about the church or whether we're talking about the kingdom. So when you look at creation, whether it's God's localizing resources or God scattering people to where different resources are, this is baked into the system. Okay? So that's kind of location number one. Business is inherently good and required by the way God has created us. So whatever conflict we feel with business is not because it's inherently evil, but there are some other reasons that we'll need to explore here in just a minute. And to do that, I want to think about then probably the majority of the time we're going to take tonight is work in economics in the Old Covenant. Right? So not the New Covenant that Christ established with his body and blood, but in the Old Covenant, that law that Israel lived under. I want to do a few things here because I really want us to understand what he was teaching them and in some ways that we struggle to appropriate this material for ourselves today, because these are some really kind of interesting things. I want to start with this text, Deuteronomy 8, 17 to 18. Deuteronomy 8, 17 to 18. Now before I read this, I'll kind of give you the setup here. Deuteronomy 6 is the great command that Jesus refers to. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your strength. That's the great commandment, and it's in Deuteronomy 6. And after this, Moses basically tells the people, he gives them, you know what a catechism is? You kind of train your children or you train yourself with questions and answers so that they sort of always have these things about the faith. Well, Moses gave them 3 questions and 3 answers. And they were, what will you do when you're afraid? What will you do when your children ask you, why are we this way? Why do we follow this God and act this way? And then the last one is, what will you do when you encounter pride? How will you handle that? And Deuteronomy 8, 17 and 18 is part of the catechism. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. Remember, God's going to prepare the promised land for them. He's going to drive the Canaanites ahead of them. They're going to walk into cities that are already built. They're going to walk into vineyards that are already planted and bearing fruit. They're going to walk into wells that have already been dug and have water for them. They're going to walk into something that's fully up and running. So how long will it take before we think, we're really good, we built a great society for ourselves? Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember that the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get or obtain wealth, in order that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. So the wealth benefits of land, of property, of ongoing business and agriculture that God gave to his people was to be a sign that he was fulfilling his promise. So a couple interesting things here. Let's just walk some takeaways from here. This would again teach us that wealth is not inherently bad if seen as coming through the Lord's provision and not of my own generation. That he's the one who enables us to do that. This one kind of deals with economic success. Pride and wealth are a bad combination, but wealth on its own is not necessarily. The real question is, why would God provide wealth to the Israelites in particular? And to get at this, we need to think about, well, what promise is he referring to? And the promise first starts in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. And some of you will know this. This is the promise to Abraham when he first gets called by God in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. And we get kind of 3 iterations of this promise to Abraham. And each time, God gives a little bit more explanation of what he's going to do. And we'll walk through all those and see how this ties to wealth for the nation of Israel. So this is how the promise begins, Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, wealth is not explicit in this text, but there are some interesting things here. What does it mean that he's going to make him great? What does it mean that he's going to transition from being a great family to turning into a great nation? And what does it mean that the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through him? Some resources are required to grow from husband and wife and no children to enough of a family to eventuate into a nationality. They're going to have to be fed. They're going to have to be clothed. They're going to have housing. And eventually, to actually be a real nation, they're going to have a land. All aspects of wealth, and God is promising that to him. But he's also promising that his purpose in giving this is so that ultimately all nations will be blessed through what he gives to Abraham. He's going to unpack this a little bit more a couple chapters later in Genesis 15. We'll start in verse 12. Genesis 15, beginning in verse 12. Now, Abraham has been promised he's going to have a child, and it hasn't happened yet. So he and Sarah begin hatching various plots on how they're going to help God fulfill this promise. And the first one in chapter 15 is they have a servant, and in those days it was not uncommon if you were childless to adopt a servant as your child. They became your heir, and then they cared for you in your old age because there's no government safety net here. There's no Medicare. There are no hospitals. There's nothing. Your family cares for you when you're infirm or when you're aged. So this was not uncommon. So they go to God and they say, got a great plan. We haven't had a child. We're going to adopt Eliezer of Damascus. You can kind of see God putting his head in his hands and going, okay, let me help you explain. Let me explain this to you. No, I have a plan for you, and it means you and Sarah are going to have a child. But let me make this clear to you. So he has Abraham set out a sacrifice. And in those days, you put the sacrifices, you cut them in half, the animals, and you laid them on 2 sides. And then Abraham spends most of the day beating away birds, keeping them off the sacrifice so they don't eat it. And eventually he falls asleep. God puts him into a deep sleep. And in it, he sees in a dream this kind of smoking pot representing God that goes through the sacrifices all by itself. That's really strange. Because in the ancient Near East, if you and I make a treaty, a contract as it were, whether we're 2 nations or 2 business partners, we make a sacrifice and then we walk through the sacrifice together side by side. The imagery is, if you break the covenant, may you be like these critters that just got blown apart. If I break it, may I become like them. May I be torn apart if I violate this treaty, this contract that we've made. Only God goes through. I'm on the hook to carry this out for you. So what does he tell him is going to happen? This is Genesis 15:12. So the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to him, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that's not theirs, will be servants, actually slaves there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. This is foretelling their time in Egypt under Pharaoh. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions, a lot of wealth. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And then he has this vision that takes place. So notice what we get here. We move to Egypt and the promise, the explicit provision of great wealth for the Israelites as they come out. Now, we'd spend a little more time here, and I wish we could. We could go to Exodus chapter 12. And we could read that everything that happens to Pharaoh, to the land, all the plagues that come on them, everything that takes place is to teach the Egyptians that God who's the God of the Israelites, is the only true God, and everything they worship is not. So he's defeated them symbolically. He's looted their country, their wealth, and taking it out because he's defeated them. Their gods are done and over. It's a visible symbol that he's truly God, and these people are following him. So if you want to get on board with the one that's really God of the universe, this is the one you worship. And you know what? It works. You know the story. It's Rahab. Rahab, the Canaanite, the prostitute, has heard about everything that's happening with the Israelites, what happened in Egypt, and so she begins to worship their God. She becomes a follower of God. She becomes part of the line of the Messiah, because she saw that he defeated their gods, that this was his people and he was pouring out his blessing on them. And she said, I want to follow. It's one of our early instances of the nations, represented by Rahab here, being blessed by what God is doing through his people, even through some of the wealth and things that he's beginning to provide for them. Now, we can go on one more text, Genesis 17. Verses 1 to 8, and this is kind of our last big installment of the promise to Abraham. And this is where things get even more explicit with regards to what he's going to do. Now, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, which means something like exalted uncle or father, but your name shall be Abraham, father of a multitude. For I have made you father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful and will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. All right? Kings. Kings are not usually impoverished. A land for the nation. They will have equity, as it were, if we will put it in contemporary terms. They're going to own a nation. They're going to own the land. God is going to pour all this out on them, but it's founded on this idea. Why? Because I'm going to be your God, and they're going to be my people. This is the relationship. Now, why does that matter? Because he's not luring them in with wealth. If you're going to lure them in with wealth, you don't in chapter 15 say, oh, by the way, there's this little thing of 400 years of slavery that you're going to get to go through. That's not exactly how you draw people in. You're never going to see the wealth. But people that you don't know that come from you that you don't really care about yet, they're going to see it like, 6 generations later, after all Abraham has is a cave to bury his wife. He owns nothing of the land but a burial plot. And after generations live in slavery in Egypt, but I'm going to do this. Why? Not for the sake of the wealth, but as a visible display, in essence, that you're my children. I'm your God and you're my people. How do I show that? I want to share with you all the good that I have. And some of what I'm going to share with you is physical good. I'm going to care for you. So you can imagine you would never have someone, a good father who has plenty of resources, starving the children, right? Who's going to care for them and give to them and move forward. So he says, I want people to know that I'm a good father and I'm going to give this to you. Okay? Now, that's wonderful until we try and figure out what that means today. And today we think, well, wait a minute, doesn't that mean then that I should be rich or wealthy or well cared for if I'm a follower of Christ? It's a little more complicated than that, because now we need to spend a little bit of time in Deuteronomy, and in parts of Deuteronomy that we usually don't spend much time in. We're going to go to Deuteronomy 28. You see, what God ended up doing was giving them a law, and in the law, this was not how they became his children and not how they stayed his children, but it is how the house of the king was going to run. I put it this way. Becoming his children was them going through the Red Sea and being delivered from Pharaoh. That's the moment they're born as the people of God, as the children of God. This is when Israel comes into being. After their birth, at Mount Sinai, he says, now let me tell you what the household rules are. Right? I've got two girls. They'll be 25 and 28 this summer. They're my children simply because they're born to us. They did nothing, they had no real part in that. But as they got older, they were able to take a part in our household rules. This is how our house will run. And your access to the privileges of this house will in part depend on how you do with the household rules. You will have greater access. So think about it at the youngest level. Greater access to my presence when you're good, right? What do we do with kids when they're bad? When they're little, we put them in time out. They're out of our presence and away from the privileges, in their case, mostly toys and snacks and TV, of the house. We withdraw those privileges. Doesn't make them not my children anymore, but it just means they have more limited access to the goods of the house. This is Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28, 1-6 is what happens when you're obedient children. And if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall be you when you come in, and blessed shall be when you go out. Now, right, lest we miss this, what he promised them was bucket loads of wealth. Not a lot of cash roaming around at this time. Herds are cash, right? You got to think, we're in Arizona, we're in the West, right? You got to think cowboy days. Huge herd, great wealth. Herd taking off and multiplying like mad, huge wealth. This is all mine. Obey the household rules. You have access to everything that's in the house. It's all yours. Now there's a flip side to that. Verse 15, Deuteronomy 28. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall be you in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of the ground, the increase of your herds, the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. You'll appreciate the image of one of the implementations of these curses in the book of Haggai chapter 1. It talks about they earned money to put it in a purse with holes. Feels a lot like today, right? That money you stick in your purse doesn't go as far as it went a year ago or 2 years ago. It's a wonderful picture of inflation. A purse with holes is where your money goes. Disobey the household rules, and I withdraw. You no longer have access to the benefits of the house, to the goods. TV, presents, snacks, toys, off limits. He's laying out household rules for them. Why? So that they can see clearly. It's a warning sign. Crops are failing. You're in old Israel. Herds are not going well. Warning bells should be going off. We must not be right with God. Because he laid it out really clearly. Access to everything if we're obedient. Access to nothing if we're not. So this is the direction that he's moving here and getting this. Now, you have to remember, none of this is about salvation. None of this is about being a child of God or not. You know how we know this? Paul's really clear about this. Paul, when he wants to describe salvation and whether or not it relates to this law, this is Romans 4, 1 through 6, he says, no. Abraham believed, and it was credited him as righteousness. Came before he was given circumcision in chapter 17, and it came before the law was given in Exodus 19 and following. His righteousness before God based on faith, just like Galatians, right? That we're saved by faith, and even that is through grace. It's not anything we do. Abraham's salvation, exactly like ours. All the in-between stuff is not about whether or not you're a child. It's about how the household runs and how it's going to operate. And Israel, as a physical household, as a nation, God operated out in the physical world primarily to see obedience and blessing, disobedience and curse. For Israel and the nations to see. This is how my house runs. Nothing to do with becoming my child, but everything what it means for us to live together in peace in this particular house. Now, I've got to do a little bit more in the Old Testament, and then I promise I'll bring this home to us today. Even in the Old Testament, things got complicated. And when you want to find the complicated stuff, you go to Proverbs. Because Proverbs does just nasty things to us. Proverbs puts side by side, answer the fool, and in the very next verse, don't answer the fool. You know why? It's trying to make the case to know which to do, you need to be wise. Sometimes the answer in life is hard. So here's a whole book of the hard things in life. Now it starts, I'll grab my drink here. It starts with the relatively easy stuff. We went through about the first half of the book of Proverbs, and it's pretty easy. It's mostly the principle, if you touch fire, you're going to get burned. So, you steal, life's not going to go well for you. You commit adultery, your life is going to be in flames. Pretty straightforward. Don't do this, and life should work pretty well. Second half of the book in particular begins to unpack, but we've all looked at the world, even during the time of ancient Israel, and for each individual, blessing and cursing does not always match obedience and disobedience. Let me say that again. For each individual, blessing and curse does not always match obedience and disobedience. And so the Proverbs are going to begin to explain this for us. How is it that the world is this way? So a couple things are going on. What God is offering in Deuteronomy 28, blessings and curses, is at the national level. What he's doing with the people as a whole, the whole household. It's not down at the individual level. The individual level, it gets more complex. So here's a basic principle from early in the book. This is Proverbs 13:25. And in Proverbs 13:25, it'll put the relationship this way. It's relatively straightforward. The righteous has enough to satisfy his appetite, but the belly of the wicked suffers want. That lines up with Deuteronomy 28, right? You generally do. And we know that today, most of the time, life does work this way. If I work hard, I'm honest. I mean, I would say, people used to ask, I was doing my PhD in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, and I'm a vice president at the bank, and they're like, how did that happen? I was like, well, to be honest, if you had any competency, you were honest, it was a big if, and you worked hard, it was really not that hard to rise up at the bank, right? So your real competition was just other people who were competent. There weren't as many around that were honest or worked really hard. So if you just fit those two criteria, it actually wasn't that hard to rise. And we've experienced that in our various places. We know that it happens this way, right? So ordinarily, life does kind of work out that way. But things can happen at the individual level. So we know that Proverbs deals with things like laziness. So Proverbs 6:10, and then we'll get a few of these, are going to begin to lay out for us the nature of kind of when life goes awry because we are not doing what we're supposed to do. So let me pull this up here. I'm going to grab a whole host of these. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Okay? If you knew me well, you would understand I have a little plaque in my office that says, I have not yet begun to procrastinate. Let me tell you how bad this is. My office mate, I was teaching in undergrad 20 years ago. My office mate, 50-year-old jogging vegetarian, drops dead of a heart attack. This was one of the things that his family gave me from his office because they knew it was a trait that we shared. And we held each other accountable on this procrastination thing. I know what it's like to fold the hands and turn over in the nap and stay there a little too long and not get work done. I'm actually pretty good at it, right? And if you do that at work, yeah, it's pretty easy to figure out how you might be poor and impoverished if you keep doing that way at work. Proverbs 10:4, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. You're not going to make it anywhere if you don't work hard. Proverbs 28:19, whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits will have plenty of poverty. Could probably name a few contemporary worthless pursuits. Not inherently bad, but if pursued at the wrong time and in the wrong proportions, YouTube, the internet in general. If you're working in the 90s, Minecraft on your Microsoft computer at work, TikTok, all those kinds of things, right? Have the ability to be worthless pursuits that we might go after. But there are also things like straight up sinful things, immorality, that are problematic for us that Proverbs will highlight. He who loves wisdom makes his father glad, but a companion of prostitutes squanders his wealth. Proverbs 11:28, whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. And it goes on to lay out a whole host of these. That sometimes the issue is that you're just living in sin. It'll go on to talk about poor financial decisions. That, there's this guy that I don't know, and he came to me and said, will you help secure a loan for me? I said, sure, I'll co-sign on the loan for you. Proverbs says, yeah, you should run really hard, really fast, because that's not going to go well for you. It's just a foolish decision. You've not been wise with your funds. But of all the passages in Proverbs that talk about wealth and poverty, less than a third of them imply that you deserve the wealth or that you deserve the poverty. Let me say that again. Less than a third of them imply that you deserve the wealth or the poverty. The most frequent is the recognition that much existing wealth and poverty is a result of murder, extortion, and deceit. Whole host. I'll just give you a handful of these. We'll start with Proverbs 29:7. A righteous man knows the rights of the poor. A wicked man does not understand such knowledge. Rights of the poor. Poor wanted to borrow something from you. They gave you their cloak. The law in Israel was you could not hold that assurance of repayment overnight. Why? It was their blanket. It's what kept them alive at night when it was cold. It was unlawful to do that. If I'm righteous, I know that, and I give you the cloak back. Because this is not about the money. This is about caring for your life. I'm wicked. I'm holding on to your insurance that you're going to pay me back. The fallow, this is 13:23, the fallow ground of the poor would yield much food, but it is swept away through injustice. One of the ways, Proverbs 23:10, do not move an ancient landmark or enter the fields of the fatherless. You can't just go redraw the lines at the county assessor and make your property bigger and theirs smaller. You're taking food off their plate. You're starving their family. The field of the fatherless, who's going to protect them? It's a kid. Maybe an unmarried wife. I'm pretty sure I can handle them. I'm just going to go take their stuff. Okay? This kind of thing, economic injustice, is oftentimes a part of this. So we have to take all of this into account. And then really, really importantly, Proverbs makes it really, really clear that wealth is never the ultimate goal. Proverbs 8, 10, and 11, take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her, wisdom. Proverbs 16, 8, better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. To be really clear, Proverbs 11, 4, riches do not profit in the day of wrath. The day of wrath is God's judgment. No matter how rich you are when he shows up to take accounting for your life, but righteousness delivers from death. Proverbs 28, 6, better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a rich man who is crooked in his ways. Okay? Wealth, economics, business, not the issue. It's in creation from the very beginning. You and I will never have the same resources, but we both need each other. In the church, we'll never have the same gifts. We're not going to be the same people, but we need each other. It's the way God designed the world. It's the way he designed the kingdom. He gave this physical manifestation to his people Israel to be kind of a blinking red and green light for them. You want to know how this is going? It's kind of like your child. Well, you don't like the way life is going? If you obeyed the rules, you wouldn't spend that much time in time out. You might have some of your privileges back. It's pretty straightforward. Let me make it simple for you. It's what he did for his people. It's what he did for the nations around them. How's it going for Israel? Are they sinful or obedient? I tell by their balance sheet. Simple, clear, like children, teaching them and leading them. But along the way, teaching them a whole host of other things. None of this is about the wealth. None of this is about the money. It's about relationship with me. And I'm trying to teach you in simple ways. So in this case, wealth is the simple stuff. Because I want you to get the deeper things. This is now where we need to come into the New Testament. Okay? So Jesus and wealth, economics in the kingdom. Matthew 10:23 lays it out, and it's not pretty. Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom. Why? Because wealth keeps me alive. Wealth gives me power. Wealth takes care of me, which means maybe I really don't need God. It's not that wealth is inherently bad, but it's really risky because I might be tempted to lean on it instead of on God. I might not remember Deuteronomy 7, that it's God who gives capacity to generate wealth. It's all given to me. So what's this perspective on wealth then? Again, it's the little stuff. Luke 16:10. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? Now here, unrighteous, not meaning that they're wicked or evil, but they have nothing to do with your righteousness. You can be righteous and rich. You can be righteous and poor. You can be wicked and rich, and you can be wicked and poor. It has nothing to do with your righteousness. We're not in that old mode anymore of Deuteronomy 28. It's the kid stuff God gives us to say, you're going to be obedient with the little things? I'm going to trust you with my church, with my word, with my gospel. That's the important stuff. If you can't handle money, why would I entrust you with the really important things? This is Jesus' perspective on this. Luke 3, beginning in verse 9. Jesus speaking, even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Judgment's coming. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And the crowds asked him, what then shall we do? And he answered them, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none. Why did I give you more? To bless other people with it. Whoever has food is to do likewise. Tax collectors came to him to be baptized and said, teacher, what shall we do? Now, the expectation here is you should say, don't be a tax collector, right? It's like maybe what we would say. Don't do that. No, just do it honestly. Collect no more than you're authorized to do. Stop abusing your power. Soldiers asked him, and what shall we do? Stop being soldiers? No. Don't extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be content with your wages. I've given it to you. Be content with it. Don't try and force more. Matthew 6:19 begins to lay this out a bit more clearly. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So old Israel, new covenant, if your heart is on your treasure, your heart's in the wrong place. Treasure is irrelevant. It's a tool to train you. It's a tool for you to use. Real treasure is where that is. And then in the Sermon on the Mount, this is where we'll end. Could do more, but we'll stop here. He talks to them even more, especially as he begins to unpack this. And he says, have you ever paid any attention, this is down in verse 25, about why you're anxious and what you get anxious about? You worry about what you'll eat, what you'll drink, about your body, what you'll put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And are you not of more value than them? And he goes on to teach them about not being anxious. Now, what's ironic here is it's not that these things are unimportant. Because he's going to say at the end of this little passage, Gentiles run after all these things. But you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added for you. It's not that they're unimportant, they're just not first. Paul says if you don't work, you don't eat. We're called to work. We're called to provide for ourselves. We're called to provide for our families. It's not unimportant. It just isn't first. The principles here then are contentment, whether I have more than I need or less than I need, and to understand that this life, where those anxieties occur, is not all that there is to life. There is this eternal perspective. That's why Paul will talk about all of his sufferings as light and momentary afflictions. Now, he's saying light and momentary, that shipwreck, beating, stoning, snake bite, not because he was drunk, right? All these kinds of things. Light and momentary, because this life is just the precursor to eternity. It's important, but it's not all that there is. And so as we look at these things and we think about the way that we want to pursue this, 2 big cautions. One is you have to know that the old rules of Deuteronomy 28 ended the night that Christ offered up his body and his blood to his disciples in the final meal. He ushered in a new covenant. And Hebrews tells us that when that new covenant comes in, the old one is dead. So if someone today tells you that if you just have faith, you'll be rich. If you just have enough faith or you do the right things, God will automatically bless you. At best, they misunderstand that that's all part of the old covenant and we now live in the new covenant. At worst, they're heretics because they sent you back to the old to earn the privileges of the household instead of sending you to the new to become children of God. those who are being recreated in the image of the Son, having been saved by grace through faith. Okay? Secondly, life just isn't simple. I cannot look at someone and know that they're righteous because they're poor. I cannot know that they're righteous because they're rich. I cannot know that they are wicked because they're poor, or that they're wicked because they're rich. I cannot do that. Even if we go back to the law, the old covenant even, it won't let us do it. Leviticus 19:15. You shall not commit iniquity in the decision. You shall not favor the poor, nor shall you give deference to the great. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Because at the individual level, wealth and poverty never indicated righteousness, even in the Old Covenant, only at the national level. So the conflict that we feel is one that we have to resolve by going back to our identity. All of us, believe it or not, are created in the image of God. So we all stand on an equal footing, regardless of our socioeconomic status. All of us as believers are children of God, and so we stand equal before Him, regardless of our socioeconomic status. And whether I'm dealing with someone who is not a believer, I still need them. We're both created in the image of God, and we are part of humanity. If I'm dealing with someone in the kingdom, we are the body, and we need each other, and we work through this. And then if I'm dealing outside the body, what am I? I'm an ambassador, here to represent Christ and the ministry of reconciliation. Money and wealth cannot come between us, because I'm here representing something so much more than the little stuff of wealth. I'm representing the big stuff, the faithful things of the kingdom. And so we don't let wealth and socioeconomic status divide us, but we come and represent the King who is beyond all of that. There's a lot more that we could do here. I'm happy to take questions, but this is the kind of stuff we have to remember to put work and identity into perspective. What questions do you have? Yes?
You made a comment about earlier on when you were in Proverbs, and you said that very often in Proverbs, poverty was the result of, and then you listed three words, one of which was murder, but I can't find it.
Murder, extortion, and deceit. If you were to kind of categorize all the ones that are in there. Most of it in Proverbs is my ability as someone of wealth or power to force you into, as it were, bad deals, to extort you to pay more, to steal through deceit and those kind of things. But those are the big categories. Outright murder, right? So this is Naboth's vineyard, where the king and queen kill him because they want his land. It's that sort of thing. So those three, murder, extortion, and deceit are the three big bucket categories of Proverbs for taking wealth from those who are less powerful. What else?
If you boiled all of it down what you shared with us, is there a verse that would strike the whole thing to be the goal or the purpose?
Well, I would go to one that we did not make it to.
Or a couple. Well, you said one, Matthew 6:33, that's definitely one.
Well, I would actually, if I'm going to go to one place, I'm probably going to go to Philippians 2. And in Philippians 2, there are a handful of principles here that are really, really quite significant. Paul is going to talk about, beginning in verse 12, therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do. He talks about doing everything without grumbling. And then by the time he gets down into chapter 4, he begins to talk about his ability to operate no matter what is going on in his life. And so the idea that he will say that I've become content, and I learned how to be content with a lot. I learned how to be content with a little. And then he's going to talk about that. That's the nature, because this is what God has poured out for him. This is what he means when he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthened me, is the idea that I can handle whatever life comes at me, whether it's too much or not enough. All of that is in there. And so this is Philippians 4:10 through 13. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. Part of how we survive is we have concern one for another. We care for each other. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Now, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. Right? That's a learned wisdom skill, to be able to do both. To be able to know how to live when I don't have and know how to live when I have. God's taught me both. The secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That's the context of that, is that I can manage regardless of what I have. Thank you. We'll do. All right, how about that? What else? I'll give you the short version of it. We're all created in the image of God. We in the kingdom are ambassadors representing the king to the world. Our economic status is not our identity, nor is it theirs. Oftentimes, we define ourselves by our economic status. We also define other people by their economic status. But we in the kingdom are defined by two. We are in the image of God, but we're being recreated in the image of God, and we stand as his ambassadors. Even someone outside the kingdom is made in his image. And we can never boil each other, either myself or someone else, down to their socioeconomic status. This means that where I was going to go with this is that when conflict occurs, I can never deploy a predetermined narrative about you. I have to adjudicate the case according to Leviticus 19. Also according to James 2, I can't show preference. But the law is really clear. I can't show preference to you because you're poor. Doesn't mean you're righteous. I can't show deference to you because you're rich. Doesn't mean you're righteous. I got to adjudicate this case. So it's about not dealing with each other according to status, but actually getting to know the individual, their identity. And our roles are communal and cooperative in creation, communal and cooperative in the kingdom, and representing the king if we're dealing outside the kingdom now as believers. So that's where that little stretch was going. So we see here that there's a similar philosophy of creation, which I mentioned earlier, in that the gifts are given in the same way. That we're not all given the same gift in the same proportion, and they're distributed amongst us so that we must cooperate in order for the body to work the same way we're required to cooperate in creation. There's a sharing of need in the body. So you look at like Acts chapter 2, they're pooling their resources, they're caring for those who are in need. Philippians 4 we already looked at. And 2 Corinthians is really interesting because even in 2 Corinthians, it's chapter 8, Paul talks about people who are overflowing, and what they're overflowing with is poverty. But they refuse to be left out of generating to the need of another part of the body. And shockingly, because God provided, they were able to contribute to this need. So Paul collects the money and he takes it from people who should have had nothing. This is like, I have a friend who's operating in Indonesia right now in the mission field, and they have 10 churches in a little place where they make on average about $4 a day, and they're supporting 20 missionaries, planting churches in Indonesia. I don't know how that's possible at an economic level, but God's providing and they're doing that. And then here thinking about Jesus on the kingdom and the righteousness of generous acts and sort of the proportionate here. And then this general principle of faithfulness in the small things, money, is about being faithful in the great things, God's goods that he's working with here. So when we're thinking about economic conflict, We need to think through that as a precursor of a way to think about bigger issues. It's never about the money. It's always about our relationship with Him and our relationship with others as we stand as ambassadors. So that's the perspective or the lens through which we have to think about economics. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of things here. At its most basic level, church has to manage its money well, right? One of the qualifications for an elder, an overseer, is that they have to manage their own household well. That also means that churches need to manage their household well so that this is kind of I can't be ignoring this in my life and then offering you advice in yours, right? This is part of why we can demonstrate that our books are well done, they're above board, we're passing our audits, we're doing all those right things to say that we're managing this well. It gives us credibility in the other places. And having been in ministry a long time, that's not always a given, that churches actually handle their financial affairs well. And I mean just above board and legit, not that they're necessarily all accountants, but just handling it honestly and legitimately. I think the other one is to not play into, so if we'd spent more time in this place on economic conflict, to not play into the narrative war. Right? The scriptures absolutely refuse the ability to say that it's just for me to look at you and say because you're rich or poor, you are therefore, fill in the blank, guilty or innocent. Absolutely not allowed. I have to adjudicate the individual case, and in many cases it may actually be quite mixed. I may have generated some of my wealth unlawfully and others of it absolutely lawfully. I may be in a pit now, part because of my own sinful stupidity and part because others have harmed me. It's rarely that simple, so we cannot engage, which is where we are culturally. We want to label, and then the label determines how we adjudicate the case. And we have to refuse that so that we're dealing with people on the basis of our shared identity as ones created in the image of God, one's in the body, and so that we're actually dealing with people at the actual identity level and not sort of at the socioeconomic label level. And so that is a particularly, I think, problem right now for us in the church. And then in modern American evangelicalism, I'm blessed because I'm wealthy, especially as a pastor, is alive and well. It shouldn't be, but it is. So the platformed pastor who has lots going on is oftentimes inherently thought of as being more godly because the Lord must be pouring out a blessing. That sort of thing is alive and well. And then lastly, health and wealth as an actual heresy is alive and well. That if you'll have all this, if you just, and we've got to work to kill that. So those are a handful of areas that I think we desperately need to work on, especially in the... What else? Now, I know you thought this was fast. It's not as bad as I was asked to teach Psalm 119 at a women's study 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I walked in the door and I said, there are 176 verses. We have 45 minutes. That's 15 seconds a verse. Buckle up. We slowed down and just took parts. But it wasn't as fast as this. I think we slowed down for tonight. Fine. All right.